Here is Sailor Manyo Haha, a blue ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. As a blue, this is lighter than is my preference, but it is very popular in the fountain pen community. Now there is tone variation by pen and a paper for sure, and it does a great job in its shading. The chromatography and the swatch really do show how light a blue the color really is. Now on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it is right on par generally as with the premium paper, so that's a real plus for this ink. Now, like I said, this is a very popular ink in the fountain pen community, but for me, I'm happy that it's a sample and that it's done, but I don't feel any kind of a need for a bottle of this ink or to pursue it any farther. It's just not an ink for me. The pen for today is a Diplomat Aero with a broad nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Now we can see on the Clairfontaine that we get a nice lighter blue that doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does have some very decent shading that's happening, something to be very happy with here. Kind of makes me think of a turquoise and what's going on in color. Now, you know, I wouldn't put this up against many of the blues that I really prefer. However, when you look at the shading in the word against, you can see, or on the third line, you can see that the A to start with is a slight bit darker than the G-A-I-N. The E darkens just a hair, but that T at the end does get quite a bit darker. Now, this is the type of shading that you're going to see throughout this ink, where there's a few letters that are much darker and a couple that are only a little bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, not a surprise that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and we can easily continue writing notes back here. Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Sailor Manyo. Here is Sailor Yodaki. Here is Sailor Yonaga. Here is Sailor Yozakura. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. In tone, this is a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering and it's not spreading. It shades, but not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. I mean, it's coming through a little bit. If you look at coming on the second line, you see in the N and the top of the G is a little bit darker than the rest of the word. Even the above it, there's some slight tone variation that's going on in the T. But in general, I find this too light on this paper to really be happy with. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and we could continue writing back here. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. The color that we're getting on the page here is quite a bit different than we had on the Clairfontaine. It's just as dark a tone, but it's certainly very green leaning at this point, like a green leaning turquoise. And it's a result of the paper showing that this is a bit more translucent as an ink, and it will be affected by the paper that you choose to write on. Now, it has no feathering and it has no spread. It does shade, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Not a surprise, being that this is a much more absorbent paper than is the Clairfontaine, which is coated. Take a look at down the wind on the first line. The Dow in down is much lighter than the N, and even the T is much lighter than the he. Wind starts fairly light and gets darker during that downstroke of the D at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no surprises. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, Pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. The tone we get here is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but we're looking at this because of its quad rule, and it does not stand out enough against the quad rule. It really kind of gets buried underneath all of those quad lines, making this not a good combination for me. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Krishna Silent Night Sky. Here is Mont Blanc Permanent Blue. Here is Noodler's Blue. Here is Organic Studios Santiago's Blue Sea. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Here we can see a lighter tone a bit than we had on the Clairfontaine. Now, it's not feathering and it's not spreading. It is still shading, which does not always happen on that paper. That is a good thing. What is a bad thing for this ink on this paper? The quad rule, that it is not standing out against. If a student were using this in their lab, while they might have chosen an ink that's very popular, I think they would have difficulty in the long term reading their notes. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, so at least that student can continue their notes back here. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page. Here is Lamy Vibrant Pink. Here is Diamine Inferno Orange. Here is Califolio Andronope. Here is Pelican Edelstein Golden Barrel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. This is the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. It shades a little less. It doesn't really feather, but it definitely spreads, and it's not looking good. That's really where I want to just leave it. I don't want to destroy this ink for this paper. It's just not looking good here. Now, looking at the page underneath, there were a couple of spots that we can see that it did lightly touch the page underneath, though it probably wouldn't stop you from using it, but it does come through and touch, and you can really see why when you look at the back of the page with how deep this ink did get consistently into the paper, meaning you could not write back here at all. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The medium flow broad nib in this Diplomat Aero did a good job of really showing the color and the performance of this ink. Now, off camera, I did go for a wet music nib to darken it up a little bit, and it did, but not a ton. Yet, it still looked better and still looked a little better as a tone for me and still shaded well. So for this, the look now, my preference is for a very wet stub or a very wet music to darken it up just a little bit. And it keeps the shading through it, so it's a good thing for it. It's just as it is a little bit too light for me. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.